This screencast is looking at how international efforts can reduce global inequalities. Now, world trade has benefited developed countries rather than developing countries, and there have been international attempts to address this. This pie chart shows us the shares in world trade, that is the exports, by region for 2009. So as you can see here, this blue segment is the European Union, had 17.2% of the world trade exports in 2009. So 17.2% of the exports came from the European Union, 13.5% from China, 11.8% from the United States, 6.5% from Japan, and Canada 3.5%. So between those areas, they had over 50% of the world's trade exports, compared to the rest of the world, which only had 47.5%. Now, in rich countries, farmers are subsidised for their crops. They can sell surplus food around the world very cheaply. Most manufacturing happens in richer countries. They make raw materials into high-value finished products that they sell to other countries for a high price. They have quotas and tariffs which restrict imports from other countries to protect their own industries. The poorer countries on the other side, the developing countries, have farmers though that are not subsidised. They can't compete with the cheap surplus products from rich countries. Many poorer countries depend on primary industries, so they often have to import manufactured products from richer countries. So they have raw materials that they sell, but not much, but then have to bring in manufactured products which cost a lot of money. Poorer countries have to compete with each other to offer the lowest prices for raw materials. Therefore, prices often fluctuate widely. Now, we need to know the key differences between loans and aid. Now, loans are sums of money that at some time in the future have to be paid back with interest. So, for example, Brazil borrowed huge sums in the 1970s. The aim was to build factories, manufacture goods for export, and make a profit. Loans were to be repaid from that profit, and this policy was successful, but however, it's not been the case in all countries. Loans from governments, world organisations and banks from countries at lesser stages of development totaled $1.2 trillion. Aid, on the other hand, is gifts of money, goods, food, machinery, technology and trained workers. True aid is not a loan that needs to be repaid. However, in the real world, some aid really is a loan because some form of payback is required. Many people in the richer world want to relieve the poorer world of its debt burden. Now, there is popular support for attempts to reduce poverty. As this photo shows, there were marches that took place in London and Edinburgh in 2005, which was about making poverty history. There were little white bands that people would wear around the wrists. It was all about trying to get rich countries to abandon the debt on poorer countries. Now, a country in need of funds for development projects can borrow from other countries. World financial organisations, you might have heard on the news, things like IMF or World Bank or international banks. If the project is a success, the debt is repaid. However, often things do not go according to plan and the country defaults on the debt, so they cannot pay it, which then has to be paid back over a longer period. People in the debtor country, in other words, country that has the debt, have to work hard to produce goods for export to fund the interest on the loan. Standard of living and level of development simply cannot improve. Poorer countries can be helped by debt relief. This means reducing the interest rate or the amount of the loan. Sometimes debts are abolished or written off. Now, debtor nations, those that have borrowed the money, benefit hugely as they can begin to improve life for their citizens. Today there is pressure for some richer countries to write off debts to poorer countries who are unlikely to be able to repay them. Now, each year in Africa, they send more money to Western bankers in interest on its debts than it receives in foreign aid from these countries. Relieving at least some of the debt would help these economies grow as long as they are well managed. We hear about this kind of, that our country giving money to these poorer countries, but actually if we wiped off the debt, that would actually be better than giving aid to these countries because it's actually a larger amount of money. So loan solutions. Micro-enterprises may be the way forward. Non-profit groups in the USA have been lending money to individuals in poorer countries. Sara Garcia in Lima, Peru, borrowed $1,845, for example, in 1984. She invested it in equipment to make patent handkerchiefs. She hired extra workers with the money and family members to help out. output rose from 20 to 500 items per day. She was able to meet the repayments on time, the technology was appropriate, and allowed the business to become sustainable and successful. Another key term that we need to know about is something called conservation swaps. These are agreements whereby a proportion of a country's debts are written off in exchange for a promise by the debtor country to undertake environmental conservation projects. These were first set up by environmental groups in the 1980s to reduce the debt problem of poorer countries and to promote the conservation of important environments. Now, between 1987 and 2001, 50 countries took part. The first swap took place in Bolivia, which is on the photograph here, in South America. A North American conservation group took over $650,000 of Bolivia's national debt. So in other words, they kind of took over the debt and were paying that money back in return for the Bolivian government setting aside a large area of rainforest as a nature reserve, which we can see here on this photograph. Other countries that have taken part in such schemes include Guatemala, Peru, Ecuador, Costa Rica and Poland. Now, when you're in the house looking at kind of different food products or different products around, or maybe kind of when you're in the supermarket, you may have seen this logo, which stands for Fair Trade. It's an international movement ensuring producers in poor countries get a fair deal. So they receive a minimum guaranteed price for their crop, which provides them with a living wage, long-term contracts for security, and skills training to develop their businesses. Around 7 million farmers, farm workers and their families in 58 poorer countries benefit from the improved trading conditions brought about by fair trade. Recognition of the fair trade mark has grown rapidly in the 21st century, and almost 70% of adults in the UK know what it actually means. Now, as we mentioned earlier, aid is something that is given by rich countries to poorer countries, supposedly as a gift, but it doesn't always work. There are two different types. You have emergency aid, or short-term aid, and you have development aid, or long-term aid. Now, short-term aid is given in the form of a disaster relief, so to help save people's lives after maybe a natural disaster. So we learned about the Haiti earthquake, and that would be short-term aid that was given to try and help them out in the immediate kind of few days after the earthquake. Long-term aid, or development aid, can build schools and hospitals and invest in industry and agriculture. There are many successes, both large and small scale. Now, during the 1990s, many people realised that poorer countries were not improving with aid, and many rich countries decided to cut their contributions back. Some aid is lost to corrupt governments and individuals. We learned about Haiti getting all that money, and yet only 2% was actually getting through to the individuals who really needed it. A lack of infrastructure can prevent development happening as planned. For example, schools and hospitals cannot operate without roads and power. Trained staff may not be available. Too much aid has been tied aid, which means the donor country gains more than the recipient country. As this diagram shows, aid can come from governments, government aid, or from non-government aid here, so other than governments. Government aid can either be bilateral, so in other words, the aid direct from one country to another, or multilateral, which is aid to international agencies, example the World Bank. Now, as you can see here, there are different types of aid down the side here. And along the top, donor countries, so the country that actually gives the money. Recipient countries, the country that receives the money. And there are advantages and disadvantages for both, depending on the different types of aid. Now, short-term aid, as we talked about, is straight after disaster. Now, people in the donor country are going to feel good about actually giving that money away. And there are no disadvantages to that donor country. For the recipient country, obviously that immediate help enables them to save lives. They can kind of rescue people and use the money very easily. The flow of aid may continue following publicity of the disaster. So in the longer terms, not just kind of straight away after the disaster. Disadvantages though, occasionally well-meaning governments and organisations fail to provide exactly what is needed. So they provide things that they don't actually need at that time. Longer term aid, the advantages to the donor countries, companies and individuals find satisfying and well-paid work in projects overseas, so they get to go and work in these countries, and the trade can continue into the future, so it continues to go. There are no disadvantages, however. To the recipient country, as we can see here, new industries improve skills and employment, new and better crops because the agricultural improvements that have been made, new infrastructure, trade again continuing into the future. The disadvantage is that it tends to be tied aid, so the recipient country becomes reliant on the donor country. Local people don't have the sufficient skills and training to reach senior posts, so they kind of have the less poorly paid jobs. Agricultural change is often not sustainable. The technology is too high. There's a lack of money for fuel and so on. May not be sufficient funding to maintain the schools at a high or adequate level. Local people often lose their land to large-scale projects. Top-down aid is coordinated by the government, so the government aid that we talked about, and it makes that donor country feel in control. The disadvantage is that projects swallow large amounts of money that donors may feel is actually wasted, that kind of shouldn't have used that money. For the recipient country, capital intensive, so a lot of money is involved. Large projects improve national infrastructure. The disadvantages, it actually doesn't really benefit the regular person directly. Bottom-up aid, so non-government aid, feel good factor again because it's given to charity. There's a link between the donor and recipient country. No disadvantages. Advantage to the recipient country, that they work with the recipient communities, have input into the projects, money's not lost to corruption, proper technology is used. Disadvantage, that charity funds may reduce in economic recession. This is something that kind of has happened quite recently with the recession that everybody's been facing. So, finishing there, different types of aid.